One of the very great key texts in Jesus' eschatology is his reference to Daniel chapter 12, verse 11. Daniel here is asking for a debriefing on the extraordinary vision he's just seen, which ends with the resurrection of the dead in Daniel 12, verse 2, where the sleeping dead, those who are sleeping in the dust of the ground, will awake up, some to the life of the age, the Haye Olam, the life of the age, resurrection life, the life of the age to come. Mistranslated in rather a vague way as eternal life. It is eternal life, it lasts forever, but it's the life of the age to come. Daniel 12 verse 2, Haye Olam. And then Daniel asks this very good question about the last phase of the vision. He wants to know how long will that last phase of this tremendous vision last. And he says, in response to that, the angel says this, in verse 11 of Daniel 12, a key, absolutely key verse. From the time that the regular sacrifice is abolished and the abomination of desolation is set up, there will be 1290 days. That's 30 days beyond the second half of the final heptad, the final period of 7. There are 77s designated in chapter 9, we know that. The last half of that would be 3.5 years, and here you go 30 days beyond that. Leaving that point aside, that's less clear. But the key point is that there is a regular sacrifice that's removed. At the same time, the abomination of desolation is set up. Jesus was profoundly interested in that verse, and so then all Christians must be too. Our Rabbi Jesus says in Matthew 24 that when you see the abomination of desolation standing, and in Mark's version, where he ought not to, I call your attention to the masculine participle there, very important, showing that Mark gives personality to the abomination of desolation. So when you see this person, or perhaps an image of that person, standing in the temple and removing a sacrifice, then you know you're close to the end. 1290 days. Now, some very few rogue translations, happily very few, tried to mistranslate all of that 11th verse and make it read as follows. From the time the regular sacrifice is abolished until the abomination of desolation will be 1290 days. That's completely a different thing. It's completely wrong. It's simply false. The point is there is a single point from which this prophecy is to be read. It's the time when the sacrifice is removed and the abomination set up until the end of the vision. That's 1290 days. It's from AB forward. It's not from A until B. So watch out for that clever trick that is played happily in only, I think, one translation known to me. The Spanish Reina Valera translation gets that wrong. But all the 70 versions I've looked at very quickly on the Bible Works 9 show, no question, the Hebrew is clear, the Greek, the Hebrew, the German and the French are entirely clear, the Spanish are clear. This is a very key prophecy. Let it not be messed with, confused, or garbled in any way, because Jesus said that was the sign that the end is really upon us. Actually, we haven't seen that abomination of desolation standing where he ought not to. That lies in the future. We are always to be ready, but we shouldn't be overheated and pretend that things can happen when Jesus said other things have to happen first. The view of Israel and the Middle East in prophecy is very interesting. It's the bad news and the good news. One can err, I think, by getting the balance wrong in those two aspects of prophecy in regard to the Middle East. In Zechariah 12, verse 3, the Septuagint version is most important. It will come to pass in that day that I will make Jerusalem a stone trodden by all the nations. Everyone who tramples on it, on Jerusalem, will utterly mock at it, and all the nations of the earth will be gathered against Jerusalem. That verse has been tamed in the Masoretic text. It should stand. It's quoted actually by Luke in Luke 21. That's the bad news. The nations are going to gather against Israel, and in the 13th chapter we read an awful prophecy of 2/3 of the nation being eliminated. That's an awful prophecy. I've consulted with many rabbis and they agree that this is a prophecy for the future. This is Zechariah 13 verse 8. It will come about in all the land, declares Yahweh, 2 parts in it will be cut off and perish, but the third will be left in it, and they will be refined. That sounds very much like the Great Tribulation time. And down in chapter 14, you'll find that in verse 2, I, Yahweh, will gather all the nations against Jerusalem, reminiscent of Zechariah 12 verse 3 in the Septuagint that we just read. I will gather nations against Jerusalem to battle. The city will be captured, the houses plundered, the women ravished, and half of the city exiled. So you have half of Jerusalem exiled. You have 2/3 of the nation eliminated in that time of great trouble. From that process comes a refined remnant of what we today call Jews, and they will provide then a nucleus for those who are allowed to enter into the millennial period. But notice the bad news is really bad news, unfortunately. It's a tragic, tragic prophecy. In Zechariah 12 verse 3, the Septuagint must be read very carefully there, in addition to the prophecies in chapter 13 and 14, which speak of very bad news for Israel. However, beyond all that, we have a wonderful time coming in Zechariah 12:10, when it says, I will pour out on the house of David, on the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the spirit of grace and supplication. This follows all the bad news that precedes it, so that they, those people in Jerusalem, will look on me whom they've pierced. That turns out to be Jesus, whom they pierced. And they will mourn for him, that crucified Messiah, as one mourns for an only son, and they will weep bitterly over him. These are Jews who are going to finally see that they crucified their own Messiah. They come to their senses, and they mourn like the bitter weeping over a firstborn. In that day, Zechariah 12:11, there will be a great mourning in Jerusalem, like the mourning of Hadad-rimmon in the plain of Megiddo. This is quite remarkable, because the Jews are going to be empowered in that day. That's after they have been decimated by their enemies. They're going to be so powerful that they'll be as strong as the house of David. They will be as strong as the angel of the Lord. They will be like Elohim himself, because God will empower them to get even with their enemies at this time. We're talking here about a remnant that survives, but before that, there is a very great deal of trouble ahead for Israel in the Middle East.
So did this all happen in 1948?
No. This evidently did not happen in 1948. The Israeli people did not get even in such a way as to then proclaim Messiah as their Lord. No. This is future. The Jews, as we know, have generally not accepted Jesus as the Messiah. You have to do that to be saved. The time is coming. All of this is prophetic, when Israel, a remnant thereof, is going to finally turn to the